Anakoto katoa. Welcome everyone. Well, now we got to officially get started. My name is Juliana Carvalho, and I will be your MC for this exciting Correro. Before we get started, a few housekeeping instructions. Please make sure your microphone are muted, your cameras are off. We have the New Zealand Sign Language interpreters, Robin and Scott, and please pin the New Zealand Sign Language if you are relying on that. This Zoom webinar is being recorded and it will be available afterwards with the captioning. We want to make this Correro as interactive as possible. So please use the chat to make your questions, make your comments. Let's make sure you know how to use the chat function. Please, can you put in the chat, where are you zooming in from today? Auckland, Wanganui, nice. Okay, Chirangi, yeah, Dunedin, Onehunga, nice, very good. Okay, let's acknowledge our speaker and panelists today. So Warren Foster, one of the authors of the report, Making New Zealand Accessible, a Design for Effective Accessibility Legislation. So Warren is a barrister and researcher with expertise in ACC law, human rights law, access to justice. Warren is currently completing an international research fellowship through the New Zealand Law Foundation, focused on how to bring the vision of an integrated person-centered system to reduce disabling experiences to life. He now lives in Haitaitai, Wellington, with his family. Our panelists are Dr. Huhana Hiki, Alexia Black, and Diane Rogers. Dr. Hu has a PhD in law and Tikanga Maori. She's a scholar of disability research and legal theory, and is noted for the breadth of her published cross-disciplinary research. One of Huhana's goals is to increase the knowledge of Indigenous people with disabilities, along with increasing their profile and inclusion in all levels of society. Huhana is currently on the Human Rights Review Tribunal. She sits on several boards. She also finds time to be a partner, a mom, a nana, a keen singer, writer, and poet. And I would add to that to be a troublemaker. Alexia Black is user experience designer and accessible information specialist. She has worked in the disability rights movement for more than 20 years, including 5 years as meeting assistant to Sir Robert Martin within the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Alexia is currently leading a project at the Ministry of Health to improve the COVID vaccination experience for our mental health and addictions communities. She's also a proud member of the LGBTQI community and uses the she, her pronouns. Finally, Diane Rogers is the General Manager, Policy and Advocacy at Blind Low Vision New Zealand. She is the Access Alliance Coordinator. Since 2014, Diane has led the Blind Low Vision New Zealand Policy Service on issues such as solutions to making New Zealand 100% accessible. Key to this is bringing evidence and data together with the people power to create change. Her policy practice motto is nothing about us without us. Before I outline the purpose and agenda today, we want to thank our sponsors, Def Ateroa, Warren Forster, and Blind Low Vision New Zealand. Okay, so why are we here today? Warren, Tom Barraclough, and Curtis Barnes, 3 top-notch legal researchers with funding from the Law Foundation, they made the report Making New Zealand Accessible, a Design for Effective Accessibility Legislation. And after the launch of the report, we have a massive response. And due to the high demand, the best solution to address all the questions and inquiries that came through was to persuade Warren to explain the report. We know that having thousands of disabling experiences in our everyday lives and not having policy to address that makes it a systemic issue. So this report is a model, is a point of reference. So for what change could look like. This report will add to our knowledge about what is possible. It will add to our vision of a fully accessible Aotearoa New Zealand. And we want to explain everything and unpack this report so you can tell us if you support it or not. We will get started with Warren explaining the report, following with panelist discussion and Q&A from audience. We will have a couple of 10 minutes break throughout the morning. We want to make things as interactive as possible, so please put questions, comments in the chat as they come up. Our amazing colleague, Yelena, Access Alliance Coordination Support, will summarize the questions and pose those questions to our panelists during the Q&A session. And we will ask everyone polling question at the end of the session. So now, Warren, can you tell us why you and your colleagues worked on this report? Tell us the story that prompted you, Tom and Curtis, to seek the funding from the Law Foundation and do this work.
Thank you, Morena, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today. So to answer this question, about 15 years ago, I was living in Montreal and had a lot of fun. And my mother had an accident and I came back to New Zealand and I got into, picked up a copy of the Accident Compensation Act and thought, how do I sort out what she needs? And that led me on a long journey. I went to law school, became a barrister, and then realized that really a lot of these issues, boundary disputes between a system that helps and others, ACC system, the wider welfare and disability system, are really quite discriminating experiences. And the further into that I started looking at the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and then how that can actually be used as a tool. And as we went down that path, we got into accessibility. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we had a conference in Dunedin. I think Who was there, Alexia was there, Diane was there, probably quite a few of you were there. And it was called Disability Matters. And what we're trying to do there is to look at how we can bring the CRPD to life. How can we make it real? And one of the key things that kept coming up is how do we learn from people's experiences? We have the same people having negative experiences across New Zealand, and then we have different people with different, within different groups having really negative experiences every day. And there's no place to gather this information and then to have a response to remove these. And there wasn't really any tight thinking around it. So we started along this journey about 4 years ago, and we started trying to think about what is it we're trying to address. And we landed on this idea of disabling experiences, which are the negative experiences people have when their impairment interacts with barriers in society. And then there's also causes about the discrimination between the ACC system and other systems of support. And this led us on a journey with 2 parallel pieces of work, the accessibility piece and the other piece that I'm working on, which will launch in a little while, about how we can have a single system based on the ACC type model, which is integrated for people. So what we found is that, that these barriers exist and they impact every day. But what we're missing is the mechanisms to identify them, and then the policy work, and then remove them. And for that reason, the barriers have continued, new barriers emerge, and that hasn't really changed now for about 10 years. So we're hoping through this work that we can actually figure out a model of legislation that will allow that to change.
Beautiful. So what are the key parts of the report? Can you explain to us
Yes. So the three parts to start with is the legislation, the standards, and the regulator. So they're sort of the infrastructure bits that we need. And then there's the notification process, which then leads to the identification of barriers. And then there's a process of removing barriers and resolving disputes that arise through that process. So I'll talk briefly about these. The idea of the legislation is that we need a law. We need one thing that says this is what we need to do. Within that, over time, we're going to need standards. So standards are one of the key tools that we use. And what we've broken the standards down into is enforceable standards and non-enforceable standards. Now, the people and the organizations then need to work together. So that's both within the disability community, the business community, within government, to work out how to address things that arise. So once we've worked that out, we need to make a standard so that everyone knows what they need to do. And it's rather than having hundreds of organizations reinvent the wheel themselves, it's much easier to have a centralized way to do this. And that brings us to this idea of a regulator. So we have an overarching body, and we say that there's a number of existing bits, which I'll go into in a moment, but bringing them all together to make them all work in a coordinated way that actually removes barriers is one of the critical design features of our legislative model. So the other three things, the legislation, the standards, and the regulator. Then we go into the way that we notify of experiences of these disabling experiences. We use that information to identify barriers, and then we look at the next step, which is removing them. So I'm going to go into this in the second wee blurb that I do in about 45 minutes in detail. But the key point is that if the burden is on the disabled person out there having the disabling experience to fix that or do something about it or get into a fight with someone, that is a very difficult burden, and that isn't really helping disabled people. What we're trying to do is to find a way where the burden of doing this work can be centralized, and it's someone's job to actually sit there and say, okay, here's this experience someone has. Here's the barriers that I can see, but there's these other problems out the side. So the example I use is if someone wants to live in an accessible house, what we need to do is not just have an accessible house. The things in the house, the way to get to the house, they all need to be addressed. And also, how can someone pay a mortgage or pay rent? So there's no point having a whole lot of accessible houses if you can't address those wider factors. So sometimes they might not be able to be addressed through the barrier system. We need a single system. This is where my other piece of work comes in, to provide that income support so that people have certainty and can actually live in a house and afford to live in a house. So there needs to be an organization whose job it is to do all this and bring it together and say, okay, here are the barriers, and this is this final point. Here's how we're going to remove them. Now, the barrier removal process, again, will end up being quite a varied process. There's some things that we know, we can write technical standards to say X, Y, Z needs to be so wide and so deep and all this kind of thing. But a lot of that we don't really know. And so the things that we know of and we're pretty sure about already, we can make into enforceable standards. Things that we need to develop the way of the future to remove these barriers, they're best to start off through a non-enforceable standard, where we get people who are actually innovating, working together, working out what it will and won't work. And then once we've nutted that down, if we need to, we can turn that into an enforceable standard. And then we're going to know through the identification process whether the barriers that people are facing are actually being removed. So there's no point having standards and saying, yep, we've got our standards, tick. But if those disabling experiences remain, then we're not actually going to bring that vision to life. So an analogy we use to talk about this is a building. So at the moment, we have an accessibility system. We have a series of walls, if you imagine walls of a building, but the walls don't have any foundation, and some walls are really good and some walls aren't. And if something starts to shake, then the building can fall down. So before we go anywhere, we need to get that foundation sorted. And that foundation is really the legislative framework that we've designed. Now, the existing regulators make up the walls, or some of the walls that exist at the moment, but you can't really walk into a building and spend time comfortably in a building if there's no roof on it. And you might need to strengthen some of the walls before you put the roof on. So what we're saying is that we need to create a system that will redesign the rest of the building. We've got a foundation, let's get some walls, let's make them strong, and then let's talk about what the rest of that building will look like, because that building needs to be accessible, it needs to be a positive experience to engage in it, and we really need to do that work before we start building more floors. So we've got to get the foundation right, we've got to strengthen the walls, then we've got to talk about what kind of building are we going to have, and what's that building going to do. And that's really what I see one of the first steps going forward is. And then once we have data, so we have a flow of information about what these disabling experiences are, that's coming through the notification process, we can say, okay, let's build a temporary room here. And that room, we're going to put 4 walls around it, and that room's job is to be a non-enforceable standard. And then we'll see if that works, and we'll see what we need to change, and how do we get collaboration going quickly to do that. And there's some tools that we can draw upon. There's things like maturity improvement frameworks, where we get people working together to say, how do we bring everyone up? But the idea is that over the next generation, we will identify these barriers, and then we can work towards building more and more floors that will actually bring this vision to life. So this isn't something that we can do in 2 years or 5 years. It's not something that I think we can do with 5 standards. We need something that will actually bring us together into the future. And that's what we've tried to design here. So that's a little bit about the idea and the metaphor or example of using a building to say, here's where we're going. And the final thing I just add is that once it comes time to remove these barriers, some of them will be able to be done through these temporary rooms, through these non-enforceable standards. But at some stage, we're going to need to turn some of these into enforceable standards. And what we've said there is when it comes to that point, there's 3 options. We have one minister make a decision on it. We have 2 ministers, for example, the Minister for Accessibility and the Minister for Transport together. Or if it's a really big project that goes all across government, Cabinet will probably need to make a decision on that type of standard. Now, as the building becomes more accessible, as it shows people it can actually work, that is then going to bring us to a point where we have a stronger building and we can reinforce those walls. Now, over time, the roof that we have, the temporary roof, which is the regulator, will become stronger. And as the walls become stronger, we can support a bigger, better roof, and we can support more levels as we go up. So that's a good example or good way to think about what our legislative model does.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Warren. And very interesting analogy, make things more relatable, easier to understand. So now let's hear from our panelists. So what are your comments on the proposed accessibility system? We want you to share your views. Whether do we need a new law to make New Zealand accessible? And let's start with Dr. Huhana, followed by Alexia and then Diane. And each one of you will have around 5 minutes for this question. So Dr. Hu.
Thank you. Always first, eh? Kia ora koutou, everybody. Yep, I've known about this legislation for a while. I've talked to Warren copious amounts of times. I guess my hesitancy is that I do believe we need a legal entity that is independent of government that can actually have an overarching view for all disability issues and laws, policies. That I believe we need a Disabilities Act itself I'm not sure that this would be comprehensive enough in the same way that the Human Rights Act is very limited in what we can address around discrimination. Because as you know, Juliana, and things like the Immigration Act, it's exempt from the Human Rights Act. And there's a whole bunch of laws that do that. However, I've been reading through it, and I have to say it's a comprehensive piece of work. Very impressed, Warren. And, you know, I think that it does cover a lot of issues, but I do believe it still needs to sit somewhere. And I'm not sure, I guess it's my experience with our government. With the Welfare Expert Advisory Group report, for instance, that should have been implemented 3 years ago, still hasn't been. There seems to be a deep reluctance from our government, whoever is in, to actually give disabled people their own voice in government, in leadership, and in just about every aspect of life. They allow us little snippets, and I don't want this to get lost if it becomes law, to become another little snippet. It needs something with it. And what it needs with it is an independent entity led by disabled, for disabled, about disabled, with allies at the table. And I believe anything less than that is not going to give it its due weight. I love this piece of law. It's very well written, but is it going to get anywhere without also having the backup of an entity, without having the backup of good enforceable law? And you know, as Warren says, that enforceability is really important. We've got too many pieces of law covering disabled people that are voluntary, non-binding. It's like the New Zealand Disability Strategy is non-binding. Tomorrow we get the announcement about what they're planning for us around disabilities from the government, but they haven't included about 70% of disabled in their consultation. They've included the DPOs. Only a few elite disabled are sitting at that table without letting the rest of us know. And honestly, without consulting with the bulk of us, they're still making assumptions about many of us, which is what the DPO does. Anyway, that's just, you know, it's like side there, but there's a lot happening. I don't want us to put the cart before the horse. I want us to be very clear that this piece of law is going to be enforced and that they will do it, rather than when the strategy came in, everything became voluntary, non-binding, and it became very frustrating for 20 years after all the work that was led to us getting to that place. And I'd like us to all come to this place together, not based on our impairments, but based on our collective approach as disabled people, to go forward together as disabled people and make a strong stand together as disabled people to say, we need this, we should have it. Yeah, I think that's it really, just as a preliminary, is, yep, it's good. It's a good proposal. It's what they will do on the other side. And I think we will know more about how its effectiveness will be after we hear from the minister tomorrow about what they're planning on transforming disabled people in the health and disability sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hu. Alexia, can we hear your thoughts now, please?
Tēnā koutou katoa. Hola, Juliana, tudo bem?
Hey!
It's lovely to be here with you all today. It's hard to go after Dr. Hu. Really great points. And, you know, you raised some things that are concerning as well to a lot of us, is that somehow things will get watered down and we'll get a symbolic accessibility legislation that actually doesn't provide us with any assistance at all, and we end up worse than we are now. So we don't want that to happen, but I do agree that we do need a law. I've had, I would like, yeah, I don't think I'm too biased to say that it's been a privilege, you know, giving a little bit of accessibility advice and being part of this project with Warren's legal team. So I just give it a once over, make sure that it's coming from a human rights model of disability, and make my thoughts known. But I honestly, nothing that I've worked on in the last 20 years has given me as much hope as this piece of legislation, if it's done properly. If it's not done properly, if it's watered down, then it'll be like ACC. It'll be creating more barriers and creating more discrimination and disabling experiences, and that's not what we want. So we want some really strong advocacy. We need some really strong advocacy on this, and we cannot just be thankful for scraps at the table. In terms of whether or not we need to have accessibility legislation, I think the past has proven that we do. I live next door to a lovely new kāinga ora house that's just been built, brand new build with steps. And it drives me batty every time I drive up to my house. Accessibility continually has been a nice to do, not a have to do. And it's 2021. We ratified the UN Convention many, many years ago, 2008. There's no excuse anymore. Disabled people make up at least 25% of our population. That shouldn't be the reason that they do something, but it should be the reason that we all can stand up and say something and be heard. Accessibility legislation is something that is always promoted by the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities when they meet with different countries. The UN Committee, for all their faults, they do try, and accessibility legislation is something that has been tried in a few different countries around the world. And like COVID and our COVID preparation or strategy, we've got a chance to build on what other people have tried. We've watched what other countries have done, Canada, Israel, with their accessibility legislation, and we can take the parts that work, but we need to make something that works for Aotearoa. We need to make something that works for Te Tiriti o Waitangi. We need to make something that works here. And this piece of work that's been put together gives us the bones. It doesn't give us the whole picture. It gives us really strong bones, or foundations, Warren, if you will. But the rest is there to be co-designed, or disabled people led would be even better. And I just think that it's, much better chance of doing something systemic instead of just one piecemeal kāinga ora house at a time, which I think we're all very tired of.
Thank you so much, Alexia. Yeah, very true. Diane, can we hear your thoughts now, please?
Sure. Thank you to Huhana and Alexia, amazing panelists. What I can add is that we certainly don't want watered down window dressing legislation. And I think what Warren and the team have done is produced a report that gives us a really strong foundation for kind of what are the absolutely must-haves in any future legislation to address barriers and prevent them. The other point that I feel personally too, that public money should not be spent on creating more barriers. That's another key component for me in terms of policy, that, we constantly see the waste of money. We're talking billions and billions of dollars here going into infrastructure, housing, transport, you name it, that just creates more barriers for thousands and, a quarter of our population. And that's just unconscionable for a little nation like New Zealand to do that. And I also, just as a thought, I think, I'm really hoping that this government, whatever it decides to do, it does take this seriously and does show leadership. I often have said to people back in 1990, the thing that really got me, I'm from Australia, so forgive the accent. Aussies had some legislation, disability discrimination legislation, and I'm not saying that that's any good, but the thing that really got me was when George Bush Sr., an American probably the most conservative Republican, the most, the guy that was cutting, like he hated red tape. But in 1990, did something pretty amazing, and that was to sign off on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if we didn't have that, decision from that guy a long time ago, even the stuff that we have now internationally that comes into our country wouldn't be accessible. So I'm kind of thinking to myself, well, if he can do it, how come we can't have a social democratic government, or one of a government of the future, a government now doing it? It wasn't, there's a lot of track record about what works and what doesn't. And I totally echo Alexia's comment that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And Huhana, you're just so right. I mean, the struggles, just the waste of time and effort, and I don't know, I just really empathize with you as an ally. And I thank you both for being on this panel today. I can't really add much more. I think Huhana and Alexia, you've nailed it in terms of feedback. But I totally awhi you, and particularly the work of Warren and the team. Thank you for giving us something in writing, a model that attempts to set out what should be in legislation. And thank you to everyone for listening to us.
Thank you so much, Diane, for your comments. No, it is impressive. It really, I'm as a migrant, I came from Brazil, and even in Brazil, we already have access legislation. Been 20 years. It's really shocking actually that in New Zealand, we cannot rely on that. And I remember one of the comments about I think was Dr. Hu saying that we need the government, to take action. But I would add that we as disabled people, we need to claim our rights, We need to organize ourselves and claim our rights, because it's no longer acceptable. Enough is enough. We need this right now. We're going to have a very quick break. We have a 10 minutes break. Please make sure you put your questions, your comments in the chat, so we will address those after this quick break. 10 minutes, go have a stretch, refresh, drink some water, and I see you back at 10:25.
Juliana, just before people leave, if people are having trouble putting questions in the chat because they're using screen readers, I'm going to read out my email where you can send questions and comments to. So it is JZID for Delta, OV for Victor, at blindlowvision.org.nz. And I'll also put that in the chat, so it's the very latest message, but I also wanted to do a verbal for people who are having trouble accessing the chat. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you back here at 10:25.